I'm Tori, and today I'm going to be talking about the book Filmish by Edward Ross. So this is a graphic book. It's not a novel because it's nonfiction, so I'm not quite sure what the correct term is, but it is a graphic book that talks all about film theory. Now, I was fascinated about this because I haven't read too much about film theory. I know a bit about the mechanics of film and like making of film, but this was more about analyzing film and film as an art form and how to look at it that way, and so that was very interesting. I like this a lot. The artist puts himself into the novel, so he's here on the cover, and then he will appear himself in scenes from famous movies depicted in the book. So basically the way this works is it would talk about something and there would be all these different little panels of films in the background. So it'll be talking about a concept and it'll run through all the different little scenes that are kind of examples. And sometimes it would make references and talk about which movies were referenced, and sometimes I would just kind of see the scenes and say, oh, I know what movie that's from, or oh, I don't recognize that, I guess I should watch more movies and keep an eye out for that scene. And so basically this book goes through a whole bunch of different examples of different kinds of movies and talks about different principles of film theory. And it has lots of little single individual panel illustrations of films, and then sometimes it will have a whole page or up to 3 or 4 pages talking about one film. So I enjoyed that. There were a couple parts I skipped because I hadn't seen the film yet and still wanted to. So I skipped over ones where it went really in depth and talked about films I hadn't seen, but the rest of it I enjoyed a lot, and I look forward to going back and reading those parts once I've seen the films. And it was easy to tell they were going to talk about a film in depth, and if I hadn't seen it, I just skipped over it and went on to something I didn't care about spoilers for. So this book made me think a lot. I was really impressed with it. It talked a lot about how film reflects on society, how it shows what society values, and how it helps kind of further those values. And so if you're not careful about it, you can be kind of entrenching a social norm that maybe shouldn't exist a little bit deeper. So it talked a lot about how film has issues. It talked about how film can relate to diversity as far as men and women's equality in film, and people who are not Caucasian in film, and how they have been very unfairly depicted throughout film history. It talked about anyone who is not heterosexual, cisgender in film, and how they've had a hard time and things like that. It talked about people who are disabled or different ages. So I was really impressed with this book. It got me to think a lot about some things I had never noticed in film that can be quite harmful to different groups of people and that say some very negative things about them. So it's great, and I had a lot of fun. I still enjoy lots of the films they talk about in this book, but it's nice to be just a little aware and say, okay, I really like this film, but it has some problematic issues, and it's good to be aware that it's doing this thing that maybe isn't so great. So Filmish is divided into 7 sections. So it talks about the eye and how we see film, and it talked about the male gaze, which is something I'd heard of briefly in like YouTube videos that talk about film theory and stuff like that before. It talks about the body and how that's expressed in film, and censorship, and how we relate to people and slasher movies and all that kind of stuff. It talks about sets and architecture. It talks about time and how films can kind of play with time and be very interesting in that way. It talks about how voice and language are used in film. Then it had a whole section on power and ideology in film, and how film can impact people, and how people have in the past used film consciously to promote messages, or how it can kind of unconsciously, those messages can sneak in even when you're not planning for them to. And the last section was about technology and technophobia, and how it's kind of interesting that in an industry based on technology, a lot of what it produces talks about how afraid we are of technology. So that was really interesting. So overall, I thought this was a very interesting little graphic book. So I thought this was really fun. I've never read a nonfiction graphic book before, and it was really interesting. It was a really fun way to kind of learn something. And I really liked it. I thought it was great talking about film to have a graphic book talking about it, because film is such a visual medium. So that was really fun, and I enjoyed this book a lot. It really made me think.